What's going on YouTube? My name is Marcus, aka Apostle, and today I am bringing you another spell break guide. This time we are going to be talking about 7 tips that I think really separate the beginners from the good players. There's going to be a lot of really good info packed into this one, so be sure to stay around. Even if some of the tips you already know, there's going to be some really niche, in-depth topics that I'm going to go into here, and I think no matter what level you are in Spellbreak, that this video is going to help you out. If you do find the video helpful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, as well as check out the Twitch stream down in the description below. And if you want to go above and beyond in supporting me, my creator code is in the top right corner, Apostle OG. You can throw that in the Spellbreak store when you're buying gold. As of right now, it only works on PC, but maybe when you're watching it, it'll work on console too. So yeah, I think this video is going to have some longevity to it. Anyways, let's get right into these tips. I wanted to start with this because one of the main questions that I get in chat is which gauntlet is the strongest? And to be fair, there really is no strongest gauntlets. Gauntlets work best in their specific ranges. For instance, Flame and Toxic tend to be better for close range, whereas Lightning and Frost tend to be better for long range. And what you really want to be able to do quickly and on the fly is decide which gauntlet is best for the situation that you're in. I'll usually tell new players in particular to run gauntlets that have very clear ranges and don't really have a lot of overlap. So if you're playing Toxic and Ice, you know that at close ranges, you're going to be wanting to use your Toxic gauntlet, and at long ranges, you're going to be wanting to use your Ice, and there's really no overlap there, whereas if you're playing like Fire or Wind, it's going to be a more fully close range build, and both the gauntlets are going to overlap in ranges where they can be effective, and that's going to cause a little bit of blurriness on which gauntlet you should be using in which situation. This can be a bit confusing on its own, and Spellbreak gets a little bit more in depth because you also need to be focusing on what gauntlets your opponent's using. So not only are you going to be wanting to focus on the strengths of your own gauntlets and playing to those, but you also need to figure out the weaknesses in your opponent's gauntlets. This isn't all dependent on range. For instance, if you're fighting a Stone Shaper, you really don't want to be fighting them in an open area because you're playing to their strengths. Whereas if you play in like a more crowded cathedral or around a lot of rocks or just in a more crowded area that's going to block the stone shots, it's going to be much better for you. But in the middle of the fight, the Stone Shaper is going to be focused on bringing you out into a field. So you want to make sure not to allow them to bait you into where they're strong, and you want to try to bait them into where your gauntlets are strong. If you can take into account the strengths and weaknesses of your own and your opponent's classes as well, that's going to boost you up an entire new level in your talent in Spellbreak. Going back to talking about gauntlets, your gauntlet has both a primary and a secondary attack. The primary tends to be a little bit more straightforward, but people tend to be a little bit confused on how to use their secondary gauntlet abilities. If you don't know, your secondary attacks are called sorceries, and what your sorceries are really good for is for defense and utility. You can use them for damage, but usually they're pretty ineffective. The only one I would say that is really good for doing a lot of damage is Boulder, or maybe your Lightning Sorcery if you have a maxed out Conduit class. Other than that, and some specific combinations like Dragonfire, there's really not a whole lot of damage options with your sorceries. What I recommend doing is learning to use them defensively. What you can do is use your sorceries like firewalls or toxic clouds or even tornadoes and put them in between you and the enemy for a little bit of protection. Firewalls and toxic clouds are great for blocking some longer range abilities like ice or conduit. Toxic is a little bit better for straight up blocking, but firewalls can really blur the vision of the opponent and make it harder to hit you. Tornadoes are going to make projectiles curve and also prevent opponents from chasing you. The reason this is going to happen is because the tornado is going to pull the opponent into it and make them run just a little bit slower and make their movement a little bit more difficult. Things like your lightning strike, your tornado, or your frost gauntlet's flash freeze can be used really well for bait to help turn around the fight. The more defensively you play with your sorceries, the better you can utilize them to turn around fights. You can start baiting people into lightning strikes or your frost gauntlet's flash freeze, and this will disrupt them and allow you to get off a bunch of damage and maybe turn around the health advantage in the fight. You can really utilize your sorceries to make some really big plays. Next up, we're going to talk about how to approach a fight. The fights in Spellbreak tend to begin before the first spell is casted. If you're pushing an opponent, you want to do it as effectively as possible. Usually, if they're distracted, you're going to want to get as close as possible before the opponent can see you. This is going to allow you to get off some big damage before they can even react, or if two teams are fighting, you don't want to be spamming attacks towards them as you're closing the distance. All this is really going to do is alert them that you're there, and then either they're going to both turn and try to kill you, or they're going to start fleeing and you're not going to be able to close the distance quick enough to actually get the kill off. You want to make sure that when you open up on a fight, you can burst them with as much damage as possible and have as much of an advantage as possible going into the fight. But let's say the opponent is already aware that you're there. If you have a long range gauntlet, you can poke at them without having to really expose yourself too much. Once you get your opponent low enough that you're comfortable to push, you can pounce on them. But be careful when you're pouncing, because a health advantage isn't the only advantage you can have in this game. Cooldowns play a huge part in the fights in Spellbreak. They're essentially a gauge for how effective you are at that particular moment in combat. You're going to want to keep an eye on your sorcery cooldowns, your rune cooldowns, and your mana. If you have no mana, you're not going to be able to levitate or cast any of your primary abilities, so you're basically going to be limited to your sorceries. Most sorceries have a long cooldown, and like we said earlier, don't really do the best damage, so until you regen your mana, you're basically just going to be a sitting duck and then have to burn even more of your cooldowns. Basically, while you're fighting, you want to get the most out of your sorceries and the most out of all of your mana. That being said, there's a really effective way to waste all of your mana. Levitating uses a really crazy amount of mana, and most people do it too much. Your levitation is almost never going to help you dodge attacks, and it uses a percentage of your mana, so even if you have a gold amulet, you can only levitate for a specific amount of time. Overusing your levitation is a great way to put yourself in a really bad situation. So, when is levitating good? What you really want to use levitation to do is reposition you to help avoid your opponent's attacks. This is especially true when you're fighting the stone gauntlet. But let's not get this confused, levitation doesn't directly counter stone, high ground does. So what you want to do is use your levitate with intent to put yourself in a better position. If you're just levitating straight up in the air, it's not going to help you out at all. You want to use your levitation to get you from platform to platform to get you better high ground or just out of the way of enemy projectiles. What I really want to make clear is that levitation is a repositioning mechanic, it's not a dodge mechanic. So keep that in mind while you're using it. Still talking about positioning, we're going to talk about how to actually get the high ground back from an opponent. This seems to be a very specific tip, but it's also a really common situation, so it's really good to know about. If you're on the low ground pushing someone that's on the high ground, you're at a pretty big disadvantage. The reason high ground's such an advantage is because you basically always have cover. All you need to do is just back up a little bit and the opponent on the low ground's not going to be able to see you anymore. If someone has the high ground and you want to take it from them, you want to be careful not to burn too many of your resources like your sorcery and your rune charges closing that gap. You also don't want to run straight at somebody who has the high ground and just levitate up to them. Essentially, what you're doing when you do this is you're closing the distance for them. You may have gotten onto the high ground with your opponent, but once you don't have any more resources like rune cooldowns or mana, you're just going to be a sitting duck and you're not actually going to be able to take it away from them. Every situation's different, and sometimes you can burn your cooldowns, but usually it's most effective to approach from an angle that requires as little levitation and cooldown use as possible. You can use your runes and sorceries to help you close the gap safely, but make sure when you actually get to the point that you're in the fight and trying to take the high ground that you have the resources that you need to still be able to fight them effectively. One of the most difficult things in Spellbreak, whether you're a beginner or an advanced player, is keeping track of opponents in fights. If you find yourself lost in a fight, especially a big team fight, it's usually time to create a little bit of distance. This will usually give you a broader view of the battlefield, letting you know where everybody's at, and also can give you some time to pop off some potions. There are a bunch of different ways to create distance. The most effective ones require either a rune charge or one of your class abilities. One of the most effective ways to create distance is to get a hide advantage. Once again, you don't want to levitate just straight up in the air. You can dash, you can shadow step, you can fly, you can use one of your class abilities just to get a little bit of height over the battlefield and give you that distance that you need to see what's going on. Keep in mind that your gauntlet and rune choice are both going to dictate the distance at which you want to fight at. If you're having a one-on-one fight and your opponent has a dash, a spring step, or a shadow step and you don't, they will most likely dominate you close range. This is because these runes provide a quick, short burst of movement, which can disorient your opponent or help you get to a better position. Say you're running like a flight or a teleport though, this means that you're usually opting to fight from a mid to long range. These are going to allow you to kite a little bit better than the short range movement runes, but personally, myself and most others think that dash and shadow step are the best runes for effectively fighting. If you guys found this video helpful, be sure to check out the live stream down in the description below. I stream Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. If you have any more questions, feel free to hop in there and ask them. I'm pretty helpful myself, as well as the community that we have around. It's a pretty awesome place to just chill, honestly. Anyways, I'm Marcus, aka Apostle, and I'll see you guys next time.